It was an ordinary morning at the helicopter base. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm golden light that cut through the light mist clinging to the tarmac. The base, usually quiet in the early hours, was slowly starting to come to life as a few workers began to prepare for the day's flights. The soft sound of birds calling from a distance was interrupted only by the occasional hum of a distant engine or the clatter of someone walking past. Everything seemed calm, peaceful even. But for Captain Rachel Scott, this was no ordinary day. She stood in the shadow of her helicopter, her hands clasped behind her back, looking out over the expanse of the base. The wind blew gently across her face, and she closed her eyes for a brief moment, taking in the familiar smells of the air, metal, oil, the faint scent of aviation fuel, and something earthy from the grass growing near the edge of the runway. It was always the same, but today, something felt different. Maybe it was just the weather, or maybe it was something else. As Rachel stood there, her thoughts were interrupted by a loud noise that suddenly filled the air. It was a sound that didn't belong on this base, the unmistakable roar of motorcycle engines. The bikes came closer, the thumping of their engines echoing off the hangar walls. Rachel turned her head toward the sound, her eyes narrowing as she saw the first few bikes appear over the horizon. They were riding in fast, without any care for the rules of the base. They weren't supposed to be here. Rachel's lips twisted into a faint, almost amused smile, though there was no humor in it. Her fingers twitched ever so slightly at her sides, betraying the quiet tension that was building inside her. The bikes roared louder, and soon there were a dozen of them, coming in from the main entrance, cutting through the air with a confidence that Rachel found almost irritating. She didn't know who these riders were, but they had no business being here. No one just showed up at a helicopter base without a reason, and Rachel could feel trouble brewing. She adjusted her flight jacket, her mind already shifting into autopilot mode. The bikes were still coming closer, kicking up dirt and dust as they tore across the tarmac. She could see them clearly now, a group of rough-looking men, their leather jackets adorned with patches and insignia, their faces hidden behind helmets with dark visors. They looked like they owned the place, like they could do whatever they wanted without anyone daring to stop them. But Rachel knew better. She had seen this before. The bikers didn't know who they were dealing with. Rachel Scott wasn't your average helicopter pilot. She wasn't the loudest in the room or the one who took the spotlight. She didn't walk around demanding attention, and she certainly didn't try to show off. She was quiet, focused, and didn't care for the constant noise that surrounded her. She worked hard, kept her head down, and did her job with precision. People tended to overlook her because she wasn't the type to draw attention. But that was exactly why they would regret underestimating her. She had learned early on in her career to keep her true strength hidden. She didn't flaunt it. She didn't need to. People often assumed she was just another pilot, just another face in the crowd. But Rachel had a history. A history that most people didn't know, a history that made her different from every other pilot who had ever flown this base. As the bikers drew closer, Rachel took a few steps forward, her eyes following their every movement. She didn't move to confront them, didn't flinch or take any action at all. Instead, she stood there, watching them, almost like she was waiting for them to make the first move. And they did. The lead biker, a tall man with a thick beard and a bandana wrapped around his head, kicked his bike into a higher gear as he sped towards Rachel's helicopter. The other riders followed suit, speeding across the base with reckless abandon. The sound of the engines was deafening, and for a moment, it felt like the whole base was vibrating under the force of their bikes. Rachel remained still, her posture relaxed, but her mind was already working. She could feel the pressure building in the air, like something was about to snap. She had seen this type of behavior before. The bikers didn't care for rules or authority. They thought they could just come in and cause trouble because they believed no one would stand up to them. But Rachel knew what they didn't. When you step into her world, You don't mess with the wrong person. The bikers came closer, circling around Rachel's helicopter like vultures, revving their engines and laughing as if they were on some sort of victory lap. The man with the beard slowed his bike and came to a stop in front of her, looking down at her with a smirk that only added to the growing irritation Rachel felt. Well, the man said, his voice loud and challenging. Looks like we found the little pilot of the base. You gonna fly that thing anytime soon, or do you just stand around and look pretty? Rachel didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, eyes locked on him, her expression unreadable. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a quick response. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him with the calm focus of a person who had seen far worse than this. The biker, sensing that she wasn't intimidated, revved his engine again, making the ground shake beneath him. What, no comeback, he sneered, the words dripping with mockery. I figured a pilot like you would have something clever to say. Still, Rachel said nothing. She wasn't interested in trading insults. She was watching the other bikers now, noticing the way they moved, the way they interacted with each other. There was something almost rehearsed about it. Like they had done this before, come into a place, cause chaos, and walk away unchallenged. But Rachel had no intention of letting them walk away unchallenged. She let the silence hang in the air for a few more seconds before finally speaking, her voice soft but firm. You're in the wrong place, and you're wasting your time. If you don't leave now, you'll regret it. The biker with the beard let out a laugh, clearly not taking her seriously. Regret? What are you gonna do, lady? We're on bikes, and you're just a pilot. What do you think you can do to stop us? Rachel's eyes glinted with a sharpness that sent a shiver down his spine, but he didn't notice. He and his friends were too busy thinking they had the upper hand. What they didn't know was that Rachel wasn't just a pilot. She was a fighter. A survivor. A woman who had seen the worst the world could throw at her, and had never once backed down. She had been through things these bikers could never imagine, things that made her ready for anything. And as they revved their engines again, drawing closer to her helicopter with a newfound sense of superiority, Rachel's fingers twitched at her sides, and for the first time, her expression changed. A smile. Not of amusement, but of certainty. They wouldn't know what hit them until it was too late. But would they even survive to regret their actions? The roar of the bikes continued to fill the air as Rachel stood unmoving, her eyes locked on the group of bikers. They circled around her, revving their engines louder with each passing second. They were testing her. The loud, menacing sound of their motorcycles was like an insult to her calm demeanor. But Rachel was used to this kind of provocation. She had seen it before. What they didn't know was that she wasn't just a pilot, she was a strategist. A quiet force, biding her time. Hey, one of the bikers shouted from the back of the group. His voice was full of mockery. We're just here for a little fun. What's the matter, pilot? You scared of a few bikes? Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't even acknowledge the insult. She simply took another step back, making sure she was positioned just far enough from her helicopter to ensure there wouldn't be any accidental collisions. Her fingers ran over the smooth surface of the aircraft's body as she turned her attention to the others. The bikers, still unaware of the impending consequences of their actions, continued to make their way around her. Some of them were making rude gestures, others were laughing as though they were the kings of the world. They thought they were untouchable, invincible in their arrogance. Little did they know, Rachel had been training for moments like this her entire life. Her mind started working behind the scenes, calculating, assessing the situation. She couldn't let them get too close. Not with their loud engines disrupting everything, and not with their disrespectful attitude so plainly on display. There was no telling what they would do next if they felt unchecked. They could easily cause more trouble if she didn't put a stop to it right now. It wasn't just about protecting her helicopter anymore. It was about protecting the base and making sure that no one, especially these loud and disrespectful bikers, would ever think they could come here and intimidate people like her. They had made their mistake when they decided to challenge her. Rachel had to teach them that lesson, and she wasn't going to back down. With a deep breath, she let her eyes scan the bikers again. The leader, the man with the thick beard, was still riding in circles, getting closer and closer with each lap. The others were following his lead, thinking they could push her to her breaking point. They didn't know her. They didn't know how strong she was. One of the bikers, a taller man with a black leather jacket that was more worn than the rest, broke away from the group. He slowed his bike and came up to Rachel, clearly trying to get her attention. He took off his helmet, revealing a rough face that seemed to reflect years of reckless living. He had an air of arrogance about him, like he was used to getting his way. "So, what's it gonna be, huh?" the man asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You gonna stand there all day, or do you actually know how to fly that thing?" Rachel's gaze didn't waver. She knew exactly what he was trying to do. He was trying to provoke her, trying to get a rise out of her. But Rachel had learned long ago that the best way to deal with people like him was to stay calm. The more they tried to get under her skin, the more they would reveal themselves. They thought they could break her with insults and threats. They had no idea who they were dealing with. "Leave," Rachel said flatly, her voice as calm as ever. "This is your only warning." The biker stared at her, not expecting her to be so composed. The others watched in silence, and for a moment, it seemed like the entire group was waiting for something to happen. They were testing her. Pushing her to see how far they could go. The leader, the man with the beard, rode up next to the other biker, clearly irritated. "What's the matter with you, man? She's just a pilot. She doesn't know what we're capable of. Let's show her a little fun, huh?" The taller biker seemed to hesitate for a second, glancing between Rachel and the leader. But something in Rachel's stance, something in the cold determination behind her eyes, made him pause. He could see she wasn't joking. She wasn't afraid of them. And the longer they stood there, the more he realized that maybe they'd bitten off more than they could chew. But the leader wasn't about to back down. He revved his engine, glaring at Rachel. "We're not leaving. Not until we've had some fun." "What's the matter, Captain? You scared of a little excitement?" Rachel's eyes never left him. She wasn't intimidated. She had been in high-pressure situations before, situations that had far more on the line than a group of rowdy bikers. She had flown through storms, navigated dangerous airspaces, and dealt with criminals who thought they could outrun the law. She had seen it all. These bikers. They were nothing. But it was clear that they didn't know that. With a small, almost imperceptible smile, Rachel stepped back and turned to her helicopter. Her fingers brushed the controls, activating the engines in one swift motion. The deep hum of the turbine engines came to life, vibrating through the air. The bikers, startled by the sudden sound, paused. The leader's eyes widened for a moment, realizing what she was doing. Rachel adjusted the controls, positioning the helicopter to face them head-on. The rotors began to spin, slowly at first, creating a gust of wind that blew dirt and debris in every direction. The bikers scrambled to maintain their balance, but Rachel didn't care about them. She wasn't trying to fight them head-on. She was sending them a message they would soon understand. The helicopter began to rise slowly, the power of the blades creating a wave of air that pushed against the bikers' bikes. The wind howled as the rotor blades picked up speed. In a single, fluid motion, Rachel guided the helicopter up, just barely skimming the ground. The sheer force of the wind sent the bikers' bikes rocking, their tires skidding as they tried to keep control. Rachel's eyes gleamed with focus as she guided the helicopter higher, the roar of the engine drowning out the noise of the motorcycles below. The bikers were now staring up at her in disbelief, realizing that they had underestimated her, that this quiet pilot, the one they thought was an easy target, was far more than they could handle. As she hovered just a few feet above the ground, the bikers backed off, their faces a mixture of shock and fear. Rachel remained where she was, hovering in place, her eyes scanning the group. They had no idea what kind of firestorm they had just stirred up. But Rachel wasn't done yet. She brought the helicopter forward, moving it just enough to send a powerful gust of wind sweeping toward the bikers. The sudden force of the wind sent the group scattering, their bikes almost toppling over as they tried to avoid the blast. The leader of the group, now realizing that this wasn't some ordinary pilot, shouted out, "What the hell are you doing? This isn't over, you hear me?" Rachel's voice came through the loudspeaker, calm but firm. "You had your chance. Leave now, or I won't stop." The bikers hesitated for a moment. Then, one by one, they revved their engines and began to back off, their pride wounded but their desire to continue the confrontation clearly fading. Rachel hovered there, her eyes never leaving the retreating group. She had won. Not with anger or violence, but with skill and control. She had shown them exactly what happened when they messed with the wrong person. She had sent a message they wouldn't forget. But the question remained, would they ever learn from it, or would they come back for more? The morning was still young, the sun's light casting long shadows across the helicopter base. It was a quiet day, or at least it should have been. But then the noise came loud, disruptive, and completely out of place. The roar of motorcycles echoed through the air, shattering the calm that had settled over the base. Rachel Scott, standing near her helicopter, barely flinched at the sound. She'd heard plenty of loud noises in her time, but there was something different about this one. It wasn't just noise, it was an intrusion. The bikers rolled in like they owned the place. Their engines thundered as they cut through the air with all the confidence of men who had nothing to lose. A group of them, rough and wild, revved their bikes loudly as they skidded across the tarmac. The sound was a constant drone, filling the air and disrupting the quiet operations of the base. One of the bikers, a man with a leather vest and tattoos up his arms, twisted his throttle just a bit more, sending a loud, obnoxious noise into the air. It was a show of performance for no one but themselves, and it was clear they expected to be the center of attention. Rachel didn't respond at first. She remained focused on the task at hand, her fingers brushing against the smooth metal of her helicopter as she made a few last-minute adjustments. She wasn't going to let them distract her. She wasn't going to let them get under her skin. But the longer they kept it up, the more it became impossible to ignore. The bikes swerved dangerously close to her aircraft, and she could hear their laughter cutting through the noise of the engines. She knew what they were doing. They weren't here to admire the aircraft or to learn anything about aviation. No, they were here to stir trouble. Their antics, their loud engines, the way they were pushing the limits, it all reeked of disrespect. But Rachel wasn't one to show weakness, and she wasn't going to let them get the better of her. Not today. One of the bikers, a tall man with a scruffy beard, leaned over the handlebars of his bike and shouted towards her, his voice dripping with mockery. "Look at this one," he sneered, loud enough for Rachel to hear. "Thinks she's some big shot pilot. What's she gonna do, take off and fly away?" The word stung, more than he could ever realize. But Rachel didn't show it. She couldn't afford to. Her eyes remained steady as she turned her attention toward the biker. He was still revving his engine, clearly trying to provoke her, waiting for a reaction. But Rachel's expression didn't change. She knew what they were doing. They were trying to break her, to force her into a position where she'd lose control. Inside, though, she could feel the tension building. It was small at first, a slight tightening of her jaw, a subtle shift in her posture. She didn't want to engage. She didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd gotten to her. But they were pushing her, testing her patience in ways they could never understand. Every word, every obnoxious rev of an engine, was adding more fuel to the fire. The leader of the group, the one with the scruffy beard, circled her helicopter a few more times, clearly enjoying the sight of her standing there, still and silent, as if daring her to do something. He wasn't used to being ignored, and that made him angrier. His eyes flicked over to the other bikers, gesturing toward Rachel with a flick of his hand. "Hey," he shouted to his friends. "Look at this. She's just standing there like she owns the place. What does she think? That her helicopter makes her important?" Rachel could feel their eyes on her now, the weight of their judgment pressing down. They didn't know her. They didn't know what she was capable of. They were so sure of themselves, so confident in their ability to intimidate her. But they didn't know the first thing about Rachel Scott. She could feel it now, the rush of energy, the spark of anger starting to flicker inside of her. It wasn't the loud bikes or the teasing words that bothered her. No, it was the disrespect. The way they assumed they could walk all over her because she was quiet, because she didn't jump to prove herself to anyone. They thought they could take control of the situation without any consequences. But they were wrong. Rachel slowly turned to face them, her body rigid with purpose. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't going to engage in their petty game. But that didn't mean she was going to let them have free rein. Not here. Not today. As the bikers circled around her, getting closer and closer, Rachel remained calm. She didn't let their words reach her. But she was paying attention. Every movement they made, every action, was a piece of the puzzle. They were careless, reckless even, and that would be their downfall. Behind her, Sergeant Mark Daniels, a veteran of the base, watched from a distance. He was leaning against the side of the hangar, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the bikers. He had been on the base long enough to know that Rachel Scott wasn't someone to be taken lightly. He knew her reputation. Knew what she was capable of. Mark had seen it before, the way she kept her head down, didn't seek out attention. People often assumed she was just another pilot, just another member of the team. But Mark knew better. Rachel wasn't like the others. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. Her reputation had been earned through years of hard work and quiet strength. The bikers, however, didn't know any of that. They were still circling her, still making fun of her, still trying to provoke her. But Mark could see the way she held herself, the way she stayed composed despite their taunts. He knew she was waiting for the right moment. He knew she wouldn't let them get away with it. Rachel's fingers twitched ever so slightly, the only sign of the tension building inside her. The leader of the bikers revved his engine again, making sure to get as close to her helicopter as possible. The roar of the engine filled the air, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Rachel's expression didn't change, but her gaze shifted slightly. Her eyes were sharp, focused, and cold like the calm before a storm. Mark took a step forward, his instincts telling him that things were about to get out of hand. He had seen enough to know that Rachel wasn't the type to start trouble. But she was also the type of person who didn't let anyone walk over her. And these bikers had crossed a line. "Maybe it's time we step in," Mark muttered under his breath, glancing around to see if anyone else was going to intervene. But most of the other staff had already gone back to their work, not wanting to get involved. They didn't know what Mark knew. They didn't understand just how dangerous it could be to push Rachel Scott too far. But Mark did. And he wasn't about to let these bikers cause trouble without consequences. The leader of the bikers shouted something at Rachel again, his words laced with venom. "What's wrong, pilot? Too scared to talk back? Come on, I thought you were supposed to be tough." Rachel didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. But her body was poised, Ready. She knew exactly what she was doing, even if no one else did. The bikers could keep pushing her. They could keep trying to provoke her. But they were walking into a trap they didn't even see coming. Every word, every taunt, every move they made brought them closer to the inevitable. Mark took another step forward, his eyes narrowing as he watched the scene unfold. He didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to intervene. He just needed to watch and be ready. The tension in the air was thick now, almost palpable. It was like something was about to snap, and everyone could feel it. Rachel stood there, her back straight, her eyes locked on the bikers. She wasn't backing down. And they were starting to realize that. The leader of the group, still trying to act tough, revved his engine one last time. You know what? Forget it. This place is lame anyway. Let's get out of here. He gave Rachel one last sneer, clearly thinking he'd won. But Rachel didn't let him off the hook that easily. Her eyes remained cold, calculating. She didn't move a muscle, but her gaze never wavered. Mark, still watching, couldn't help but smile. He knew Rachel would never let anyone disrespect her, no matter how hard they tried. It wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The biker leader took a long, mocking look at Rachel, still revving his bike aggressively, as if daring her to do something. His friends were growing restless, shifting on their bikes, glancing at each other as they sensed the shift in the air. They had expected Rachel to back down, to apologize, to somehow admit defeat in front of them. But instead, she stood like a stone wall, completely unyielding. Let's go, guys, the leader shouted once more, his voice tinged with annoyance as he throttled his bike again. She's not worth it? The other bikers glanced at each other, some of them shifting uncomfortably as Rachel's unflinching gaze bored into them. It was like she had become a stone statue, calm, powerful, and completely unaffected by their bravado. And yet, beneath that calm exterior, something was building. Something they hadn't seen yet. Rachel took a slow step forward, the soles of her boots making soft, deliberate noises on the concrete as she closed the distance between herself and the group. She didn't rush. She didn't make a move until it was absolutely necessary. But her movements were precise, controlled, like she was taking each second to carefully choose the right action. The leader of the bikers seemed to take this as a sign of submission, his smirk growing wider as he began to feel the upper hand slipping away from him. You want to play it tough, huh? He sneered. Thought you'd get away with it just because you fly around in helicopters. Big deal. You're just like all the rest of the little girls trying to act tough. Rachel's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. His words were designed to hurt, to break her spirit. But she knew better. He had no idea what she had faced before. He had no clue what she was capable of when pushed to her limits. But that's what made her so dangerous. She didn't respond to threats. She didn't need to. She walked another few steps toward him, her presence alone making the air around her feel thicker, heavier. The other bikers started to sense something was off. They had expected a confrontation, but it was clear now that this wasn't about proving who was stronger or louder. This was something entirely different. Is that all you've got? Rachel's voice was low, but sharp. Every word she spoke felt measured, like she was carving out a space for herself in the midst of all the noise and chaos. The biker leader faltered for just a moment. The shift in her tone wasn't what he expected. The crowd of bikers seemed to hold their breath, waiting for something to happen, and Rachel didn't disappoint. Suddenly, the sound of an engine starting up filled the air, the unmistakable whine of a helicopter's rotor blades beginning to turn. Rachel didn't break her gaze from the leader, but the rest of the bikers turned in unison toward the helicopter, their faces lighting up in surprise. The chopper, which had once seemed like just another part of the base, was now coming to life. Its blades began to spin faster, cutting through the air with a sound that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The bike's noise faltered in comparison. The wind from the chopper's blades grew stronger, pushing against the bikers, sending their bikes wobbling slightly in place. Rachel didn't care. She wasn't about to let them control the environment. The leader's smirk faded as he watched the chopper lift off, its huge body slowly rising from the ground, casting a massive shadow over the group. He had thought he was dealing with a pilot who was nothing more than a woman in a uniform. But now, as the helicopter took off in full view of them, he began to realize just how wrong he had been. Rachel's eyes gleamed with quiet confidence, and the wind began to pick up around her. The sound of the helicopter's blades slicing through the air was almost deafening now. It was as if the base itself had come to life, the machinery roaring louder than the bikers ever could. "Get in line, or get out of the way," Rachel said, her voice cutting through the noise. Her words weren't threats. They were commands.